right, today we're taking a look at this is actually the Japanese automatic transmission company, Jatco RE5R05A. And this transmission is very popular. It was used there from the early 2000s, up until about, I guess you can find it on quite a few later model, but it usually kind of phased out in 2011-12 in favor of its big brother, which is the 7-speed unit. This is a 5-speed unit, obviously. It's very popular in the Nissan Frontier and Nissan pickup and Nissan SUVs, and also on Nissan Infinitis. You'll find this unit. Now, sometimes when you ask me, hey, what did this transmission come from? I'm not sure, because I don't necessarily see the vehicle. This is a sister shop, and we do the rebuilding of the transmissions here. The actual removal and replacement is done by our main shop. Now, this unit actually came to the shop. Now, this transmission came to the shop. One of the complaints was a torque converter clutch shutter. Something that we're going to be paying very close attention to when we rebuild this transmission is the condition of this O-ring. Now, obviously, I got a brand new one in the kit. Now I'm going to be replacing that. Of course, as you put the unit together, this is the first thing off and the last thing to go on. Make sure you don't forget it. Now, obviously, this transmission is getting a remanufactured torque converter. One of the problems that plagued this transmission was the transmission oil cooler that was, part of the lower tank of the radiator. And what would happen is it would develop a leak and allow engine coolant to ingest into the transmission fluid, and oftentimes in small amounts over a long period of time. And this would have a very detrimental effect on any of the rubber in the transmission, and can cause all kinds of problems. Now, it doesn't appear that this particular unit has that problem, but that's something that we basically want to be very sensitive to with this transmission. If that were the case, what we do at our shop is we completely bypass the radiator oil cooler, sometimes replace the radiator, depending on what the customer wants, and we add an aftermarket air cooler, which is a heavy-duty transmission cooler, out in front of the condenser. So that works very nicely and completely alleviates the problem without necessarily replacing a sound radiator. Now, as you work on any automatic transmission, the very first step that you want to do is take a look at the oil pan. Now, I actually wiped this pan out, but there was very, very little material in it. And you want to carefully take a look at these two magnets that are on the bottom of the pan. And what these are for is to capture any metal shavings. Obviously, ferrous metal is not going to do any good with aluminum that escapes there into the transmission fluid as a result of excessive wear. So obviously, if these magnets are great big full fur balls, and I see a mixture of clutch material and aluminum in the pan, I know that this transmission is torn up bad. But this one was not. This is a high mileage unit, but it was in excellent condition. Something else we want to look at is the transmission filter. Now, Jatco decided to use a screen on this model transmission, and that's actually a very fine screen, one layer. And oftentimes when, like for instance, the converter clutch starts to deteriorate or I get excessive amounts of clutch material, it can actually block this screen. So we have seen that happen. It does a reasonably good job of protecting the valve body, but oftentimes if you have lots of metal in the transmission, or especially if we have a transmission hydraulic pump failure, it's going to inject metal directly into the valve body, and that's going to be a real problem. Sometimes we can rescue it, sometimes we opt for replacement. So this is kind of the first step in evaluating the condition of the automatic transmission before you start to take it apart. Okay, now here we're getting ready to remove the valve body from the case, and a couple of preliminary steps. One thing that I'd like to do is go ahead and let's remove this retainer there for the connector from the vehicle. And remember, the transmission control module is part of the valve body in this model year on this transmission. So this is the first thing we're going to do, is remove this retainer. All right, now I've removed the retainer from the electrical connector. Now I can actually unplug the harness from inside, but I usually like to remove the connector to inspect it carefully and freshen up its O-ring. Now this is actually the output shaft speed sensor, and of course obviously this is going to have to be taken loose, and so we just want to very gently kind of pick up its retainer and put it here to the side. Now the turbine and intermediate speed sensors are there as part of the transmission control module. All right, so now we're ready to go ahead and remove the bolts that are retaining the valve body to the case. Now, when I say remove the bolts retaining the valve body to the case, there are a lot of bolts here. Well, which ones am I actually removing? Well, obviously these in the very middle have nothing to do with retaining the valve body to the case. And one thing that happens on this particular model is these bolts can be different lengths. But let's just go through and just kind of mark each bolt that goes into the case. Now you'll notice there's an identification mark on top of each bolt, and these bolts are actually different lengths. Now don't panic, because what happens is, as you'll see in a moment, if you're not sure where the bolts go, just simply look at the length of the bolt, go ahead and drop it in the hole that you think it belongs in, and see how it sits up from the valve body. And if it sits very, very high, well, obviously you got the wrong one. And if it falls down in, well, obviously that's not the right one either. So what we're doing is we're going through, and I'm just kind of marking the bolts that I'm actually interested in. And sometimes I actually miss. Some of these I'm taking off, I may not need to. So here we go. This is one. And I believe I have to take him off too. So here we go. Now we'll go ahead and use our speed handle. You could conceivably use an impact, but we'll go ahead and loosen these bolts. Okay, here we have loosened the bolts that retain the valve body, and as you go around loosening the bolts so the valve body's not coming up, actually you missed one, these bolts can be different lengths. Now, but you'll notice that when I have the valve body in position and I install a bolt, that the height of the bolt from the valve body is approximately the same for all the bolts. And here, these two bolts are the same, and they actually have a marking there on them that helps identify them. And here, these two bolts are exactly the same length. Now, really, the only oddball right here is this bolt that's absolutely flat there on the top, that's part of the manual valve body. Now, it wouldn't hurt very carefully as you take these bolts out is to simply lay them in order. And that would certainly be a good idea, so there wouldn't be any confusion where they go. Now what I've done is I just simply laid my valve body retaining bolts to the case out in the order that I removed them, and I'll put this to the side and it will be undisturbed, and there it will kind of remind me as I go back together. Okay, so here I'm carefully lifting my valve body off the transmission. Now what happens is I actually have removed the retainer and actually used my little rubber hammer to give this a couple of taps. Now you could have actually unplugged this and pulled this loose from the valve body there in the case. But it's cleaner and better to do it this way. Now, one of the problems with this Jetco unit, the RE5R05A, is that here on some of the earlier transmission control models, or modules, I should say, the actual metal conductors coming up to the solenoids would have a tendency to fatigue and break. And this seems to be the big offender. And when they do so, you'll get a solid code for an open circuit for that shift solenoid. And one of the things that we've successfully done is disassemble these and actually carefully inspect and resolder that, and that has worked successfully for us. And of course, you can purchase all kinds of remanufactured units. Now, we're not having that problem with this valve body. This one's nice and clean. Here we see the turbine and intermediate speed sensors, and remember that the output speed sensor is separate from the valve body. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this valve body and very carefully set it in the pan, and this will actually be put off to the side. Okay, now as we remove the bell housing and the front pump, one of the things we want to be sensitive to is the band. Now, here's the band adjustment. Of course, I'm going to be replacing the band and carefully readjusting this as I put the transmission back together. Now, I don't actually want to remove the servo at this point or remove the band anchor, because I want to inspect them and remove them after I pull the front pump so that I can kind of see their orientation. If I just pull these right now, they'll kind of fall loose into the case. An undesirable situation. All right, now that you've removed the valve body, this is an excellent diagnostic opportunity to do a quick air check. Now, what I have is simply shop air. Now, I actually have a regulator on my compressor, so this is down about 30 psi. And what we can do is go through and check the different apply elements. And here I'll start out with the band. And of course, we want to be a little careful it doesn't spray fluid back at us. But here, let's listen for the band. Very good. Very, very good. No problem right there. Whoop. And that's what I was talking about. This is front lube, so obviously this is just the lubrication passage there to the gear train. And there on this model, as I go up, we're coming to the different units here. So here we see input clutch, so this is going to be an important one. Yes, very good. No problems. No problems. This is definitely a good transmission. Now, what happens is if I look at these right here, what I'm looking at is torque converter clutch pressure. And sure enough, I feel it coming out the front there. And so here we go. Okay, now this is actually the torque converter clutch apply. So the sealing rings are there, no problem. All right, let's move to the back. And here we're taking a look at the forward brake. And let's try this one. No problem. Here's reverse brake. No problem. Okay, here we have high and low reverse clutch pressure. No problem. Here, now when they say small and large, that's the different areas of the piston. So this is the small area, the direct clutch. No problem. And then we move across. This is the low coast brake pressure. Very good. And here we see direct clutch, large pressure. And here we see the rear lubricating hole, which of course obviously is just going to allow transmission fluid to lubricate the rearward portion of the gear train. Now, you're probably asking the obvious question, what in the world are you guys doing? Why are you even taking this transmission apart? Well, this is a high mileage unit, and what the customer has requested is the disassembly for inspection and replacing of all paper and rubber. And what do we talk about when we're talking about that?